Artificial intelligence. It's going to transform human societies in ways we can hardly predict and enable a new golden age where people don't have to work at all and yet enjoy high standards of living anyway. Unless, of course, it's going to destroy us all in a fiery apocalypse. Hence the reason why people have looked at the dizzying pace of change of this technology and asked themselves, how can we regulate this? How can we control it? At least stop it from spiralling out of control and biting us? Turns out that's not as easy a question as you might think. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Last week, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak hosted a landmark two-day summit on the risks of artificial intelligence and how governments worldwide should respond, how they should regulate it. The summit was hailed as a success. If nothing else, it's an interesting case study of how things do, and often don't, get done in the geopolitical landscape. So, why was it considered a success? Well, by the end, nearly 30 countries, including the big rival players, the United States and China, had signed a shared communiqué outlining the risks, setting up a new global network of AI researchers, and perhaps most substantially, getting agreement to allow governments to review the most advanced forms of a rapidly developing technology to check for potential harms. Few international summits end up with as much as that. Why was it an interesting case study? Well, it really wasn't until pretty late in the day when it was even remotely likely that this event was going to be a success at all. And this is the basic reality of a mid-sized player, in this case the United Kingdom, seeking to establish itself as a leader in a particular area. The danger of declaring yourself a leader is that you get made to look ridiculous when nobody follows your leadership. In the months leading up to the summit, the proposed event was being heavily criticised by campaigners on the one hand, and diplomats on the other, for various reasons to do with its area of focus, the creation of something separate to existing mechanisms like the G7, various vested interests and so on. At the early stages, world leaders had been declining invitations. Biden declared early, although he announced that his VP Kamala Harris would be going in his stead. The UK team were jetting across the planet, doing all the backroom work of trying to drum up support. France, never want to lend support for something that might bolster Britain's standing in the world, originally wanted to send a very junior minister, although this was eventually raised to the finance minister. But the really big question was China. China is, of course, one of the two big global players in artificial intelligence, and particularly in the question of how AI might begin to shape conflict scenarios that are kind of the stuff of nightmares. Some in the Prime Minister's own party had attacked the idea that China should be allowed to attend at all. But for most, it would kind of be crazy to think that you should have this conversation seriously without them in the room. One UK official told the Politico website this: right up to the last minute, we weren't sure if the Chinese would come. The team were literally monitoring flights departing Beijing all day Monday. Let that sink in. The summit is about to start, and you still don't know for sure that one of the most influential delegations is even going to show up. And they're not telling you. You're monitoring air flights to see if they're getting on one or not. It's kind of wild. But anyway, come they did. The UK official also reflected on the importance on that. Once we knew the Chinese were in the air, we knew that getting the United States and them signing the communiqué was close. Of course, relatively late, it was also announced that Elon Musk would also be attending. Now, say what you like about Musk, and people have got plenty to say, but it was nevertheless a rock star in attendance moment. as was brought home by the fact that he ended up being interviewed by the British Prime Minister himself. Now, all the optimism from governments about their ability to regulate AI, it's all very well, but it's potentially undermined by two things. One, the fact that, as well as being concerned about the harm that AI can do, governments like the US and China and the UK and France and a number of the others remain quietly very interested in developing AI as a weapon to use to further their own interests in an increasingly fractious geopolitical theatre. And two, the fact that a small number of AI companies are currently in rapidly driving development fostered by their own self-interest, and this dynamic is likely shaping any future regulatory framework in spite of what might become seen in retrospect as too little too late efforts by governments. Now, on the first of those two, you can't ignore that these discussions are taking place as key states are engaged in something of an artificial intelligence arms race. Russian President Vladimir Putin, remember him? He declared some time ago that the country that leads in AI technology will rule the world. Obviously, he was not present at Sunak's summit. China, though, has also declared its intent to become an AI superpower, and while the US, when it comes to AI on the battlefield, has said that it believes a human being must always be in the loop, China instead is known to favour targeting what's referred to as a singularity, a point where the use of AI means that events progress on the battlefield faster than human beings can keep track of. Even before you get to the battlefield, you have to contend with how states are interested in AI as a tool, for example, a tool of surveillance. Obviously, China is the market leader here, with its use of facial recognition software and other algorithms layered over a large network of surveillance cameras looking over its own citizens. But as Edward Snowden revealed, it's not as though the US hasn't used all the tools at its disposal in the past to sift through huge amounts of data on people's internet usage, all in the name of counter-terrorism, of course. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, Mallen, didn't US President Joe Biden just sign a new executive order on regulating AI? And doesn't this new executive order guarantee that AI in America will be safe, secure, and trustworthy? I mean, it's actually named the executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence. The clue, you say, is in the name. Well, maybe, but then Biden also passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was about climate change and not really in any way whatsoever about inflation. So I presume if they produced a bill called the Protection of Puppies Bill, I would still recommend you read the detail. What? Does that mean I'm against the protection of puppies? How terrible. You see how this works. Anyway, Biden's executive order isn't entirely toothless. It directs various federal agencies and departments to create standards for the use and oversight of artificial intelligence with a focus on protecting civil rights and liberties. Sounds fantastic, but most of its provisions don't, because of the limits to the power of the executive branch, have the force of law behind them. So you have to be a little bit cautious at reading it as the final triumph. In other words, it's detailed, nuanced, and by no means certain how it will work, if it will work at all, in practice. So, do we wholly trust these states to regulate this technology in a way that's actually about protecting us, the citizen, from its misuse? Maybe we do, but then that is also affected by the other undermining factor that I mentioned. As for that one, Yann LeCun, one of the so-called godfathers of artificial intelligence, did a lengthy post on Twitter arguing that a small number of powerful companies are seizing control of AI's future, regardless of what anyone might think to be desirable. OpenAI, Google DeepMind, and Anthropic. These companies were identified by LeCun as doing massive programs of corporate lobbying right now, trying to be the ones who at least influence the setting of the rules. Instead of worrying about AI bringing about the apocalypse, LeCun argued, we should be caring a lot more about the fact that these powerful corporations seem likely to determine the direction of travel, to be based on what benefits their bottom line, not necessarily what's good for us. He might have added, like social media companies did 10 or 20 years ago. But then, he works for Mark Zuckerberg, so that would be kind of awkward. In principle, this should be exactly the sort of problem that one of Rishi Sunak's big achievements should be able to tackle. 8 companies, including the 3 that LeCun mentioned, agreed to deepen the access to their work by this new AI task force. This is intended to allow safety testing to be carried out on new models. Rishi Sunak explained it like this. Until now, the only people testing the safety of new AI models have been the very companies developing them. That must change. New models will now be tested for safety before being released, which sounds like, it could be a recipe for bureaucratic delay based on lack of clarity over what makes a new AI model unsafe or not, because I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if Rishi Sunak does, which is just another way of saying that the devil is in the detail, I suppose. The thing is, with a new technology that most people don't fully understand, there comes a momentum effect, where controls are always trailing events. And there becomes a knowledge gap, which can be exploited, at least in the short term, by those with the knowledge. By highlighting the dangers of AI, that could lead governments to implement controls in the name of risk management that give themselves the monopoly of the ability to misuse it. Don't forget, governments like the US and the UK avoided in the past the idea that states like Russia and China launching hacking attacks should be labelled as an action of war. They did so without stating so much until it was revealed by Edward Snowden and others, because they themselves were fully engaged in exactly the same sort of activities. So they didn't want them to be registered as an act of war. Basically, powerful states will not want to give up any technology or process in which they feel confident that they are the leading practitioner. If America has the best hackers, it won't worry so much about Russian hackers. It will always believe it can frustrate them and indeed better them. It's just the rest of the world that suffers the consequences, so that's all right. The thing is, unlike hacking, which is inherently a hostile act against a system, artificial intelligence has got enormous promise for society, especially in an age where birth rates are declining and therefore workforces are shrinking even as elderly populations are growing. It's no accident that China is one of the countries most actively engaged in developing humanoid robots capable, with the help of artificial intelligence, of filling in some of the spaces left by that shrinking workforce. At Sunak's summit, Elon Musk went so far as to predict that in the future, AI would mean that nobody needed to work anymore at all. Which would be more impressive if Musk's predictions weren't so randomly all over the place, because it wasn't that long ago he was predicting catastrophe if people didn't have more babies to replenish the workforce. So, he's a bit stream of consciousness when he speaks about such things. But it's true, nevertheless, that whichever way it goes, people are exercised about artificial intelligence because it genuinely is likely to be a transformational moment in the history and development of the human race. In 100 years' time, assuming we're still here as a species, when we look back on how it all played out, I will go out on a limb and say that I'm not convinced the story will be one of wise and timely regulation, skillfully directing it into those avenues for the most benefit of humanity. At least, not without making some pretty big mistakes along the way. Well, let's hope we survive them, eh?